There are places in this country where the trees grow so thick that sunlight never reaches the ground. Places where the trails end and nothing picks up on the other side. Park rangers spend years working in those places. They file reports, they follow protocols, they answer questions from visitors about wildlife and weather and trail conditions. But there is one subject most of them will not discuss, not officially, not on the record. Some things that happen in the deep woods stay in the deep woods, not because rangers forget, but because they learn very quickly that talking about certain things does not make those things go away. It only seems to invite them closer. These are stories from people who worked in, lived near, or traveled through some of the most isolated national forests in the United States. Their names have been changed, the locations are real, the experiences they described were submitted to us in private. We are not here to tell you what is real and what is not. We are only here to tell you what they said happened. So turn the lights down and listen carefully. Story 1, The Shape Between the Trees, Cold Open. I have been a park ranger for 11 years. I have dealt with lost hikers, injured animals, illegal campfires, and storms that came in so fast they turned afternoon into midnight. I have never been afraid of the woods until the winter of my 7th year, when I started seeing something on my early morning patrols that I could not explain. Something that moved the wrong way. Something that was always just far enough away that I could tell myself it was an animal. I almost convinced myself of that. Almost. Personal setup. My name is not important. What matters is that I was stationed at a ranger outpost near the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. It is one of the largest national forests in the Midwest. Almost 1.5 million acres of mixed hardwood and pine. In summer it gets tourists, fishermen, campers, hikers. In winter it gets quiet. Most of the seasonal staff leaves. The visitor center's close. You go weeks without seeing another person outside of the small team that stays on for winter patrol. That year, our winter team was just 3 people. Me, a woman named Cora who handled the eastern quadrant, and a senior ranger named Miles who had been stationed there for over 20 years. Miles was the kind of man who had seen everything the forest could throw at a person. He was calm, methodical, and not given to exaggeration. I want you to remember that because what I am about to tell you involves him too. Normal routine. Winter patrol in that forest is mostly routine. You check trail conditions. You look for downed trees that might block emergency vehicle access. You check on any remote structures, like fire lookout towers and maintenance sheds. You file daily reports. My patrol route took me through the western section of the forest, which included about 14 miles of fire road and a stretch of trail that ran along the edge of a frozen lake called Drumlin Lake. I did this route every morning starting at 6. In winter it was still dark at 6. Sometimes it was still dark at 8. I had done that route so many times I could have driven it with my eyes closed. I knew every bend in the road, every unusual tree, every spot where deer like to cross. That routine is why the first morning I noticed something, I paid attention. Because I knew what was supposed to be there, and what I saw was not supposed to be there. First strange detail. It was a Tuesday in early January. The temperature that morning was around -12 with wind chill. Clear sky, full moon still up, which actually made the snow glow a little. Visibility was good. I was driving slowly along the fire road, near the north end of Drumlin Lake when I saw something at the tree line. About 60 yards off the road on the right side. At first I thought it was a deer. The shape was tall and thin, just standing there. But deer do not stand that still for that long. I stopped the truck and rolled down my window. Cold air hit me immediately. The shape did not move. I watched it for maybe 2 full minutes. It was at the tree line, partially behind a cluster of birch trees. In the moonlight and snow reflection, I could make out a tall, thin shape, long limbs, no obvious movement. Then it was gone. Not gone like it ran, just gone. Like 1 second it was there, and the next time I blinked, it was not. I sat there for a moment, then wrote in my log, possible deer or large animal at North Tree Line, Drumlin Lake Road. No further movement, continued patrol. Rational explanation. I did not think much about it that day. Northern Wisconsin in winter. There are wolves, deer, the occasional black bear that should be hibernating but is not. There are coyotes, foxes, and every now and then a bobcat. Shadows at the tree line are normal. Shapes in low light play tricks. I had learned that a long time ago. The moon was still out. The birch trees are white. A deer standing still between white trees and low light is easy to misread, easy to make look larger or stranger than it is. I mentioned it to Cora at our check-in that evening. She shrugged, said she had seen something similar on the east side a few weeks earlier. A tall shape near the ridge. Turned out to be a dead tree that had partially fallen and was leaning against another tree at an angle. That made sense. I filed it away and stopped thinking about it. That was my first mistake. Second strange event. It was 10 days later when the second thing happened. Same stretch of road, same general area. But this time it was not early morning and it was not one shape. I was coming back from the south end of my route around 3 in the afternoon. The sun was already low. In that forest in January, 3 in the afternoon looks more like dusk than afternoon. I was driving at about 15 miles per hour when I noticed the tracks. They crossed the fire road about 20 yards ahead of me. I stopped and got out. The tracks were large, larger than wolf tracks, larger than anything I had training to identify. They came from the tree line on the right, crossed the road, and continued into the tree line on the left. The stride was long, very long. The space between each print was easily 4 feet, maybe more. I measured with the handle of my ice scraper, which I knew was about 22 inches. Each print was roughly twice that distance from the next. A large moose can leave tracks like that. Moose stride lengths can be significant, but these tracks were narrow, not wide like moose prints, and they were not cloven. They were more like a single wide depression in the snow than a split hoof print. I stood in the road for a while, looking at them. Then I took photographs, recorded a voice note for my log, and got back in the truck. I did not follow them into the trees. I want to be honest about that. Something about standing there, looking at those tracks going into the dark tree line made me not want to follow them. And I am a person who's trained to investigate. Investigation. I sent the photographs to Miles that night. He called me back within an hour, which was unusual. Miles was not a phone person. His first words were, "Where exactly on the road?" I told him. "Mile marker 7, north of Drumlin Lake." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would come out with me the next morning. We met at the trailhead at 6. Miles looked at the photos, again on his phone, then looked at the tracks in person. The cold had preserved them well overnight. He knelt down next to one. He put his own hand beside it. His hand is large, the hand of a man who has worked outdoors for decades. And his hand looked small next to that print. He stood up without saying anything for a long time. I asked him what he thought it was. He said, probably a moose. The snow distorts prints sometimes, makes them look different than they are. But he said it while looking at the tree line, not at me. And then he said something I have thought about many times since. He said, "How long were you standing out here when you found these?" I told him maybe 5 minutes. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Next time you find something like this, get back in the truck faster." I asked him why. He just said, "Protocol." There was no protocol I knew of that said that. I had read every manual. Proof. It's been 3 weeks later, I had a camera running. I had mounted a trail camera on a pine tree at the edge of the fire road, near mile marker 7. We used them sometimes to track wildlife populations. It was not unusual. I checked it every 3 days. On the 8th day, I pulled the memory card. There were the usual things. A fox crossing the road at 2 in the morning. A deer at the edge of the frame. Wind moving the branches. And then at 4:47 in the morning on the 6th day, something moved through the frame. It was dark. The camera was infrared, so everything came out in that greenish-gray night vision color. The shape came from the right side of the frame and crossed toward the left. It was tall, taller than a deer, taller than a moose. But it did not move like a moose. A moose moves with its head down or level, heavy, plodding through snow. This shape moved upright, not bent forward like a bear. Upright like a person, but stretched somehow, like the proportions were wrong. The image was not clear. Trail cameras at that range and in those conditions are not high resolution. But the shape was there, in the frame for about 4 seconds, moving at a steady pace toward the left, toward the tree line, toward the lake. I watched that clip probably 30 times. The most disturbing part was not the shape itself. It was the stride length. I had a reference point because I knew exactly how wide that road was. 22 feet curb to curb. The shape crossed it in 3 steps. Escalation. I showed the footage to Miles. He watched it once. Then he closed my laptop. He sat for a moment without speaking. Then he said he was going to log it as inconclusive wildlife footage and put it in the general observation file. I asked him if he was serious. He said yes. I told him that was not a moose. I told him I did not know what it was, but it was not a moose. He looked at me directly and said, "I know." That was all he said. I pressed him. I had worked with this man for years. I trusted him. I pushed him in a way I had never pushed him before. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There have been reports like this going back 60 years in this forest, not just from rangers, from loggers before that, from the people who lived in this region before the forest was designated." He said the reports described the same things. A tall shape at the tree line, tracks that did not match any known animal, disappearances of hunters and hikers that were eventually attributed to exposure or falls, but that sometimes did not add up. He said he had seen something himself years ago in the eastern section. He would not describe it. He just said, "You do not want to draw its attention." The ones who kept investigating kept going back, kept trying to get a clearer look. Those are the ones who had the worst experiences. I asked what worst meant. He said, 2 rangers in the 80s. They kept going back to where the tracks were. One of them ended up on medical leave for 8 months. The other one transferred and never came back. Neither one of them would say exactly what happened. Panic/escape. 2 nights later, I made a decision I still question. I went back to mile marker 7 at night, alone. I told myself I just wanted to see. I parked the truck and turned off the headlights. The moonlight was bright enough to see the tree line clearly. I sat in the truck with my window cracked, listening. The forest was completely silent, not quiet, silent. No wind, no animals, no sound of any kind. I have been in that forest in every season and in every kind of weather. There is always some sound. Even in deep winter, there is the creak of branches, the sound of something moving through underbrush, a distant bird. That night, there was nothing. I had been sitting there for about 20 minutes when I heard something. It was not a loud sound. It was a low, rhythmic sound, like something breathing very slowly, very deeply. It was close. Not in the truck, but close to the truck. Maybe just outside the window. I did not move. I sat completely still. The breathing sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then it stopped, and something knocked on the roof of my truck. Once. Not a branch, not debris falling from a tree. The sound of something deliberate. One knock. Directly above the driver's seat, I started the truck. I did not look in the mirrors. I did not look out the window. I drove. I drove the entire 14 miles back to the outpost without stopping. My hands were shaking by the time I got there. I sat in the parking lot for a while before I could go inside. I never went back to mile marker 7 after dark. Outside help or failed help, I filed a detailed report the next morning. Everything. The shape I had seen on the first morning, the tracks, the trail camera footage, what happened the night I went back. I submitted it to the regional office. 2 weeks later, I received a response. The response noted the trail camera footage, described it as inconclusive, and recommended continued monitoring of wildlife activity in the area. It said that the sounds I described could be attributed to wind, settling ice on the lake, or small animals moving in proximity to the vehicle. The knock on the roof was attributed to a falling branch or ice from a tree. That was the entire official response. I showed it to Miles. He was not surprised. He said, "They never do anything with these, they just file them." There is a whole cabinet in the regional office, apparently. Years of reports, all filed under inconclusive. He said he knew a ranger from a different forest, further north, who had tried to escalate a similar report. Went to a supervisor, tried to get a formal investigation, reached out to a wildlife biologist at a local university. He said that ranger no longer worked for the service, not because they were fired, because they chose to leave. Because the experience of trying to get someone to listen, combined with what they had seen, became more than they could manage while still doing the job. I understood that. I understood it very well. Aftermath. I stayed at that posting for 4 more years after that winter. I transferred eventually, not because I was pushed out, but because I needed to be somewhere that did not include mile marker 7 on my morning route. The trail camera is still there. I do not know who checks it now or what they have found. Miles retired 2 years ago. We still talk on the phone occasionally. We do not talk about mile marker 7. We have an unspoken agreement on that. Cora left the year after I did. She sent me a message when she put in her transfer request. It just said, "I finally saw something on the east side. I understand now." I never asked her what she saw. I did not think it would help either of us to know. I still work as a ranger, different forest, different state, different terrain, but I still do my early morning patrols the same way. I still stop sometimes when I see a shape at the tree line, and I still notice when the forest goes completely silent. When it does, I get back in the truck. Final unresolved line. I do not know what was in that forest. I do not know what knocked on my roof. What I know is that Miles had worked that forest for over 20 years, and he told me not to draw its attention. I think about that sometimes when I am driving a fire road in the dark. I think about the word attention, like it noticed, like it was aware, like it could choose. Story 2, what the visitors described. Cold open. The strangest part of this job is not what you see yourself. It is what the visitors describe. Because they describe the same thing over and over again. Different people, different years, different trails, different parts of the park. The same thing. Personal setup. My name is irrelevant. What matters is that I spent 6 years working visitor services at a national forest in the upper Midwest. My job was partly educational, partly safety-oriented, and partly administrative. Part of that job was processing incident reports. When a visitor had an experience they felt was worth reporting, whether it was a wildlife sighting, a trail hazard, a strange sound, anything, they could fill out a form at the visitor center or submit it online. I processed hundreds of those reports over the years. Most of them were ordinary. A lost trail marker, a bee sting, a close encounter with a deer, a coyote that got too comfortable near a campsite. But there was a category of reports that I came to think of privately as the other file. I never named it officially. It was just a folder on my computer where I moved reports that I did not know how to categorize. By the time I left, that folder had 112 entries. Normal routine. The reports came in year-round, but they clustered in 2 periods, late October through January, and then again in April, just after the thaw. I noticed the clustering in my 2nd year. I thought it was coincidence at first. By my 4th year, I had stopped thinking it was coincidence. The reports shared certain details regardless of when they came in or who submitted them. A figure seen at a distance in the trees, tall, thin, wrong proportions. A sudden silence in the forest, an absence of normal sound that preceded or followed the sighting. A sense of being watched that visitors described as different from normal unease. Several people used the word deliberate, like they felt that whatever was watching them was not just aware of them, but was making a decision about them. And a smell. I did not expect that detail. But it appeared in multiple independent reports, a smell described as animal, but also wrong. Sour, heavy, like something between wet fur and decay, but not quite either. First strange detail. The report that first put me on alert came in during my 2nd October. A couple who had been camping in the northern section for 3 days submitted it. They were experienced campers. Their report was detailed and calm, which was unusual. Most unusual experience reports are either vague or slightly frantic. This one was methodical. They described hearing movement around their campsite on the 2nd night, not inside the perimeter but circling it. At a regular interval, like something walking a slow circuit around them. The movement continued for approximately 2 hours according to their account. When morning came, they found impressions in the soft ground around their campsite. A ring of them, roughly 3 to 4 feet apart, circling the site almost completely except for a gap near the tree line to the north. They included photographs. The impressions were not clear enough to identify definitively, but they were large and they were consistent, and they formed a deliberate ring. The couple said they would not be returning to that campsite. I filed the report in my regular system. Then I created the other file and put a copy there. Rational explanation. I showed the photographs to the head ranger on duty that week. He looked at them briefly and said, "Bears sometimes circle campsites, looking for food smells." He said the impressions were probably deer, disturbed soil from root systems, or the couple themselves not remembering exactly where they had walked. That was plausible. I accepted it, but I kept the file. Second strange event. 8 months later, a solo hiker came in looking shaken. He sat down in the visitor center and asked if anyone else had reported strange sounds on the Northern Trail. I asked him what kind of sounds. He described a low sound, not a howl, not a growl, not any sound he could compare to a known animal. He said it was rhythmic and deep, and it seemed to come from multiple directions at once, or from something very large. He said he had been hiking for 15 years and had never turned around mid-trail before. He turned around that day. He wanted to know if there was a known animal in the area that made sounds like that. I told him about wolves, bears, coyotes. He shook his head to all of them. He said, "It was not any of those. I know what those sound like." He paused and then said, "It sounded like it was imitating something, like it was almost right, but not quite." That last part. Almost right, but not quite. That detail appeared in 3 other reports in my other file. Investigation, I started going back through the older records, and not my file. The actual archive, which went back to when the visitor center opened in the 1970s. The paper records were not organized by subject. They were organized by date. So I spent several evenings going through them manually, looking for anything that matched. I found 15 reports over a 20-year period that described similar experiences. The tall shape, the silence, the feeling of being watched deliberately, the sound that was almost right but not quite. Some of those older reports had handwritten notes in the margins. The handwriting belonged to a former head ranger based on the signature, someone named Robert Halliday, who had served at that station from 1978 to 1996. Most of his marginal notes were routine. Trail conditions, follow-up actions, that sort of thing. But next to 4 of the unusual reports, he had written just 2 words, "Not wildlife." That was it. No explanation, no further note. Just, "Not wildlife." Proof moment. I tracked down Robert Halliday. He was retired in his late 70s, living about 2 hours from the forest. I called him and said I was doing a historical review of visitor services records and had a few questions about reports from his tenure. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked which reports. I described the category. The tall shapes, the silence, the sounds. He did not respond immediately. Then he said, "I wondered when someone would call about those." I asked him what he meant by his marginal note, "Not wildlife." He said exactly what it says. Those reports were not describing a known animal. I investigated 3 of them personally. I never found an explanation. I asked him if he'd ever seen anything himself. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Once near the north end of the trail, in the winter, I saw something standing at the tree line that I could not identify. I watched it for several minutes. It watched me back. He said he had spent years afterward trying to find an explanation, read everything he could find about large unknown animals in the region, talked to wildlife biologists, reached out to researchers who studied unexplained phenomena. He said the researchers were the ones who first used the word. I did not bring it up. They did. I asked what word. He said the word quietly, just once. Wendigo. Escalation. I want to be careful here. I am not a person who believes in folklore as literal truth. I grew up in a family that valued science and reason. I had a degree in environmental studies. I was the person in the office who organized facts and reports. But what Halliday described to me was not folklore. He described a systematic pattern of reports from a specific geographic area over multiple decades that shared consistent details. He described his own experience as a trained professional who had spent nearly 20 years in that forest. He said that after he retired, he found out that similar patterns existed in other forests, not just in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, in Michigan, in parts of Canada, in forested regions of the Pacific Northwest, different forests, similar reports. He said the consistent thread across all of them was the same. Rangers and Forest Service staff who encountered the reports were never officially encouraged to investigate further. He said, the policy has always been to attribute it to a known cause and move on. I do not know if that policy exists because no one believes it, or because someone does believe it and does not want the attention. I did not know what to say to that. He ended the call by saying, keep your other file, but be careful who you tell about it. I had not mentioned my other file to him. I had never told anyone what I called it. Panic/escape. The moment that made me stop being curious and start being afraid happened on a Tuesday afternoon in November. I was locking up the visitor center. It was about 5:30, already dark. The parking lot was empty except for my car. I was walking to my car when I heard something. It was the sound the solo hiker had described. The low rhythmic sound, the almost right sound. It was coming from the tree line at the edge of the parking lot. The tree line was maybe 40 feet away. I stopped. I stood in the parking lot, keys in my hand, and I listened. The sound continued for maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped. And in the silence that followed, I saw a shape at the tree line. Tall, just standing there. The parking lot lights were on, but the light did not reach the tree line clearly. The shape was dark and still. I did not freeze. I want to be clear about that. I made a choice. I walked to my car, got in, locked the door, and drove away. I did not look in my rear-view mirror until I was on the main road. When I did look, the parking lot was empty. Outside help or failed help, I submitted a formal report to my supervisor the next day. I described what I had heard and seen. My supervisor was professional and thorough. She took notes. She said she would have the area around the visitor center checked by maintenance staff and that she would note my concern. She also said, gently but clearly, that working in an isolated forested environment, particularly in the darker months, could sometimes affect a person's sense of unease in ways that were worth taking seriously. She asked if I was sleeping well. I said yes. She asked if I had been under any unusual stress. I said no. She recommended I take a few days of personal leave. I did not bring it up again officially, but I did contact one researcher, a wildlife biologist at a regional university who had published work on animal behavior in northern forests. I sent her a summary of my other file. She responded 2 days later. She said the pattern was interesting and asked if she could see the original documents. Then, 4 days after that, she sent a follow-up email. She said she had looked at my summary again and concluded that the most likely explanations were misidentification of known wildlife and pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns and shapes in ambiguous visual information. She said she appreciated me reaching out. That was the end of the correspondence. Aftermath. I left that position after my 6th year. I took a job in a different field. I still live in the region. I deleted my other file before I handed in my work laptop. I kept a printed copy. I do not know what to do with it. I am not sure sharing it would change anything. I am not sure anyone in a position to investigate would investigate. What I think about most is not what I saw or heard. What I think about most is the clustering. 112 reports over 6 years, clustered in late autumn and early spring, from the same general area of the forest. 112 people who described similar things independently, who had no reason to coordinate their stories, who were not seeking attention, who mostly just wanted to know if anyone else had experienced the same thing. Final unresolved line. I still drive past that forest sometimes in November when the trees have gone bare and the sky is low and gray. I look at the tree line when I pass. I have not seen a shape there since I stopped working at the visitor center. But I find myself looking anyway, just in case. Story 3. The missing person report that should not have been closed. Cold open every year. Thousands of people go missing in national parks and forests across the United States. Most of them are found. A hiker who went off trail, a child who wandered from a campsite, someone who misjudged the weather or the terrain. But some cases close without resolution. And some of those closed cases have details in them that do not line up. I found one of those cases. I was not looking for it. Personal setup. I worked search and rescue for a county that bordered a large national forest in Michigan's Upper Peninsula for 9 years. I was not a ranger. I was a volunteer with formal training who worked alongside rangers and emergency services during active searches. I participated in over 60 searches during those 9 years. I found survivors. I also found people who did not survive. I am describing this so you understand that I am not someone who scares easily, and I am not someone unfamiliar with difficult situations in the woods. What I am about to describe is not something I have fully resolved. I have thought about it for 4 years since it happened. I am still thinking about it. Normal routine. The case started as a standard missing person report. A man in his late 30s, experienced hiker, had gone into the forest for a solo overnight trip and had not returned by the following afternoon. His car was at the trailhead. His emergency contact had called it in. We assembled a team and began a standard grid search. He had filed a trail plan, which was good. He had listed his intended campsite and his return time. He had the right gear for the conditions. It was late September. Cold nights, but not life-threatening with proper equipment. He had the proper equipment. We had no immediate reason to fear the worst. First strange detail. We found his campsite on the second day of the search. The tent was still standing. His gear was inside, his food supply, his sleeping bag, his spare clothing, all of it. His boots were inside the tent. That detail stopped everyone. His boots were inside the tent, neatly placed at the foot of the sleeping bag. An experienced hiker does not leave camp without boots. In September in the Upper Peninsula, the ground temperature drops overnight and the terrain is rough. You do not go anywhere without boots. The boots were not discarded. They were placed neatly, side by side. Nobody said anything for a while. We just looked at the tent. Rational explanation. The search coordinator said it was possible he had left camp in a medical emergency, a sudden illness or confusion. Hypothermia can cause irrational behavior if it sets in quickly enough. People with severe hypothermia sometimes remove clothing. It is called paradoxical undressing. It did not seem like the right explanation for the situation. He had been experienced. The temperatures had not been severe enough for a rapid onset hypothermia, and his other clothing was still in the tent. But it was an explanation. We continued the search in expanding circles from the campsite. Second strange event. On the third day, we found his tracks. They led north from the campsite into a section of forest that was off trail. Dense, old-growth timber. The kind of terrain an experienced hiker would not choose to walk through without a clear reason. We followed the tracks. After about a quarter mile, the tracks stopped. They did not reach a stream or a rocky surface where they would naturally disappear. They stopped in the middle of soft ground where tracking conditions were actually good. There were prints going north, and then no more prints. One of our team members, a tracker with 30 years of experience, walked the area for almost an hour. The track simply ended. He came back to the group and said quietly, "That does not happen." Investigation. We widened the search from that point. We brought in a dog team. The dogs followed the scent from the campsite north, the same route the tracks had indicated, and they also stopped at the same approximate location. The dogs were agitated, not in the way they behave when they lose a scent. They were agitated in a way that the handler said she had not seen before. They were trying to pull back, away from that spot. The handler was a professional with 10 years of experience. She said later that her dogs had never refused to continue a search before that day. She said she had not forced them to continue because their behavior told her continuing was not the right thing to do. We searched the surrounding area for 2 more days. We found nothing. Proof moment? On the 5th day, we found something. It was about a mile north of where the tracks ended. A tree, large pine, old. There were marks on the bark, high up, much higher than a person could reach standing on the ground, maybe 12 feet up, possibly higher. The marks were deep, parallel gouges in the bark, evenly spaced. They were not claw marks from a bear. A bear mark is wider and less uniform. These were narrow and precise. They looked deliberate. Our team coordinator took photographs. When he submitted them later, the official assessment was that they were bear marks, likely from a bear climbing the tree or marking it territorially. The wildlife biologist who gave that assessment was contacted from the regional office, not from our team. Our team coordinator told me privately that he had studied bear markings for years and had never seen marks that looked like those marks. He said whatever made those marks was tall, and it was not a bear. Escalation. The man was never found. The case was officially closed approximately 14 months after the search, classified as a lost hiker, presumed deceased due to exposure or accident. The boots in the tent were noted in the report. The tracks that ended without explanation were attributed to changing ground conditions. The dog's behavior was attributed to fatigue and environmental factors. The marks on the tree were logged as bear activity. I read through the official report several times. Every single unusual detail had been given a conventional explanation. Every single one. What stayed with me was not the individual details. It was the consistency with which the unusual was made ordinary on paper, because I was there. I saw the tracks. I saw the dogs. I saw those marks on that tree. And I know what the report says, and I know what I saw, and those two things are not the same. Panic/escape. This is the part I have not told many people. On the last night of the official search, I was posted at the outer perimeter of the search area on the north side, alone, monitoring radio communication and watching for any sign of the missing man coming out of the forest on the northern edge. It was around 2 a.m. The forest was completely silent. I was sitting against a tree with a flashlight and a radio when I heard the sound. It was rhythmic, low, like breathing but scaled up, like something very large, breathing very slowly. It came from inside the forest, north of my position. I sat still. The sound continued for what I later estimated was about 3 minutes. Then something moved at the edge of the tree line. I could see it in my flashlight beam, at the absolute edge of the range. It was tall, standing upright. In the beam, I could only see its lower half, from roughly the knee down. Long, thin legs. And it was standing still. My radio crackled. Someone was doing a routine check-in. I answered. Normal voice, normal words. When I looked back at the tree line, the shape was gone. I did not report what I had seen. I completed my shift and returned to the staging area at 6 a.m. I told myself I'd been tired. That low light and exhaustion had made me see something that was not there. I told myself that for about 2 months. Then I stopped lying to myself about it. Outside help or failed help, I connected with 2 other members of the search team who had been on that case. One of them, without me prompting, described hearing a low sound on the second night of the search. She had attributed it to wind. The other described seeing a shape at the tree line on the morning of the 4th day. Neither of them had reported what they saw. All 3 of us had stayed quiet. I asked them why. One of them said, "Because who would you even tell?" And the other one just nodded. Aftermath. The man's family was told he likely got disoriented and died from exposure. I do not know how to feel about that. I think about him. I think about his boots, placed neatly at the foot of his sleeping bag. I think about tracks that ended with no explanation. I think about 3 people who saw or heard something during that search, and none of them reported it. I am not saying I know what happened to him. I am saying I do not believe the official explanation. And I do not think the people who wrote that official explanation believe it either. Final unresolved line. His family still goes to that forest every September. They leave flowers at the trailhead. I have driven past the forest in September myself, once since the case closed. I did not stop. I did not look at the tree line. Some things are better left where they are. Story 4. The one ranger who talked cold open. Most rangers will not talk about it, not officially, not on the record. But there was one person who sat down and described everything she had seen over 19 years in the forest. She did not ask for anything in return, she just said she was tired of keeping it to herself. Personal setup. She asked me to call her Diane. She'd retired from the Forest Service after 19 years. She'd worked in 3 different national forests, all in the northern Midwest. We spoke by phone for nearly 3 hours. What follows is as close as I can get to what she told me, in her own words. Diane's account. She said the first time she encountered something she could not explain was in her 3rd year in a forest in northern Minnesota. It was not a sighting, it was a sound. She was doing a night check on a remote maintenance structure about 8 miles from the main station. She heard something walking alongside her truck, not behind it. Alongside, keeping pace. She was driving at about 20 miles per hour on a gravel service road. Whatever it was, kept pace with her for about half a mile before she accelerated and left it behind. She said, "I have thought about that for 16 years. Whatever it was covering 20 miles an hour on foot, through snow, through the dark. I cannot tell you what does that." She said the second major experience was in her 8th year in a different forest. A colleague of hers had gone out alone to check a downed communications line and had not come back on schedule. When they found him, he was sitting in his truck at the edge of a fire road, uninjured. But he could not explain how he had gotten there or why he had left the communications tower before completing the job. He had no memory of the previous 3 hours. Medical evaluation found nothing wrong with him. He never returned to field work. He transferred to an administrative role and left the service 2 years later. Diane said, "He never talked about that day. Not to me, not to anyone I know. But I was the one who found him sitting in that truck. And I can tell you, the expression on his face was not the face of someone who was confused or disoriented." She paused. It was the face of someone who had made a decision to not think about something. The thing she saw, the most significant experience Diane described, was in her 14th year. She was patrolling a winter trail on horseback. The station used horses for certain trail conditions where a vehicle could not manage. She was alone, about 6 miles from the station, when her horse stopped. She said, "That horse had never refused to move before, not in years of work. She just planted herself and would not go forward." Diane looked up the trail. There was something standing on the trail approximately 200 yards ahead. She described it as tall, upright, thin in a way that did not look natural. The proportions of the arms were wrong relative to the body, too long. She said it stood there for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 30 seconds. Then it moved off the trail, into the trees and to the left. Her horse still would not move forward. Diane eventually turned the horse around and rode back to the station. She filed a report describing an unidentified large animal on the trail. She did not describe the proportions. She did not describe how long it stood there. She did not describe the way the horse had refused to move. She said, "I knew by then. You learn to give the report a shape that fits the file. Otherwise, things get complicated." What she believes. I asked Diane directly what she thought she had seen over those 19 years. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I grew up hearing stories, indigenous stories, local stories. The forests in this part of the country have their own history, and that history includes things that do not appear in wildlife management manuals." She said she had spoken with elders from local tribal communities who lived in proximity to these forests. She said some of those conversations had been the most clarifying of her career. She said what they describe is consistent. The behavior, the characteristics, the relationship to specific seasons and specific territories. It is not a legend in the way outsiders think of a legend. It is a description, a factual description of something that actually exists in those forests. She said the word clearly, Wendigo, and she said, I am not saying it is supernatural. I am saying it is real, and I am saying that there are people in the Forest Service who know it is real and have made a decision that the public does not need to know. Why she talked. I asked her why she was telling me this after 19 years of staying quiet. She said, because people go into those forests every year, and some of them do not come back, and the explanation they give the families is never the real explanation. She said, I am not trying to cause panic. I am not trying to start something. I just think people deserve to know that there are places in this country where the normal rules do not apply. And if you are going into one of those places, you should know that. What she said at the end. At the end of our conversation, I asked Diane if she had any advice, if there was anything specific she thought people should know. She said, when you are in the deep forest and the sound stops, when everything goes quiet and you cannot hear a single natural sound, that is the moment to leave. She said, not the moment to investigate, not the moment to take photographs, the moment to leave. She said everything else, the shapes, the sounds, the tracks, all of that comes after the silence. The silence is the warning. Most people do not recognize it as a warning until it is too late. She said she had never been hurt, never been touched, never been taken. But she had colleagues who had gotten closer, and she had watched what that did to people. She said the ones who got closest were never quite the same afterward. Not because of what happened to their body, because of what they saw, because of what it means to know that something like that exists and to know that you are very small compared to it. She thanked me for listening. And then she said one more thing, quietly, before she ended the call. She said, it has a sound, not the breathing, not the walking, its own sound. Once you hear it, you know it. You will know it forever. I asked her to describe it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I would rather not. Aftermath. I tried to verify Diane's service record through publicly available information. I found a record consistent with someone of that name and approximate service history in the Forest Service system. Not enough to confirm everything, but enough to confirm she was real and that her posting history matched what she described. I reached out twice more after our initial conversation. She responded once to say she had said what she needed to say and preferred not to speak further. I respected that. Final unresolved line. I still think about what she said. The silence is the warning. I have been in national forests since that conversation, more than once. And I can tell you honestly, there have been moments when the forest went completely quiet around me, and something changed in my chest, a tightening, a pull toward the nearest trail back. I listen to that feeling now. I always leave. Channel outro. There is a reason some things are never officially explained. Not because the explanation is too complicated, but because the explanation changes something. It changes the way you think about the trees at the edge of a parking lot, the way you feel on a trail when the birds stop, the way you understand a news story about a hiker who never came home. These stories were submitted to Crypt Whisper by people who wanted someone to listen. We listened. If you have experienced something in the deep woods that you have never been able to explain, you can reach us at Crypt Whisper. We are not here to judge. We are not here to make you feel like you are imagining things. We are here because some stories deserve to be told. Stay on the trail, trust the silence. And if everything around you goes quiet at once, do not wait to find out why.